Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Selçuk, for arranging this, and thank you for inviting me along. And thank you for turning out in as much as you have. You probably sat somewhere comfortable watching. So I hope you'll feel it's worth giving up your time. So in this talk, I aim to outline the key arguments of my recently published book, The Next Welfare State, UK Welfare After COVID-19. In my comments, I'm not going to follow the order of the book, but I do try to capture its core arguments. Some of you will notice that I seem to omit most of the evidence, and my graphs are largely for illustrative purposes and not always sourced, but I promise you the evidence is all there. And if you want to find it, please just read the book. It's astonishingly cheap. It may not be a bargain, but it's cheap. And Policy Press will sell you a copy for £10, I think, until the end of January. So if you are interested to find out more, then, as I say, the long version is there. And I'm going to use illustrations. I know not everyone likes them, but I'm not AJP Taylor, and I don't want to be a talking head for 40 minutes. So I'm going to disappear while I talk, and then I'll reappear magically towards the end, if that's okay. Okay, I'll begin by saying something about the immediate impact of COVID-19. And while it's clearly too soon to say anything definitive about the long-term effects of COVID on the welfare state, we do already have a full 2 years of experience upon which to draw. Now, the UK's vaccine programme has been widely described as a success story, but much less time and attention has been paid to the performance of the welfare state in both its long-established and its emergency forms. But it is almost as striking a success. There have been some notable failures. In the first year of test and trace, £37 billion was spent to remarkably little effect. Botched transitions between hospital and care homes in the first wave of infections clearly led to a substantial increment of unnecessary deaths. But while the NHS has repeatedly groaned under the strain, it has not yet been overwhelmed in the ways that many feared in the early days of the pandemic. At the same time, living standards and the economy have not collapsed. The immediate economic impact of COVID plus lockdown in early 2020 was unprecedented, with GDP falling by around a quarter in 3 months. But the government took decisive action to protect businesses and employment. For businesses, there were loans and deferral of tax payments. For employees, there was the job retention scheme and its self-employment equivalent. So at its peak, close to 9 million jobs were furloughed, with the government paying 80% of employees' wages, up to £2,500 per month. In terms of the established welfare state, the numbers on universal credit nearly doubled between March and July 2020, from 3 million to 6 million. And the government increased payments temporarily by £20 per week. A number of the normal conditional elements of benefit provision were suspended. As everyone knows, the overall cost of that was enormous, perhaps an additional £230 billion of government expenditure in 2020 to 21 alone. And there was a corresponding leap in the level of public debt to stand above 100% of GDP by the end of 2020. Although the cost of all this government borrowing was very cheap in 2020 to 21, an unanticipated increase in the rate of inflation, if and when it brings increases in interest rates, will make this debt increasingly costly to service. The funding problem will be with us for at least a generation. But the interventions worked. the economy had returned to something like its pre-pandemic size by the beginning of 2022. Unemployment, which the OBR had once expected to rise to around 6.5% in 2021, peaked at just over 5% in the autumn of 2020. It had been higher than this for fully 7 years following the economic crisis of 2008. And in 2021, the OBR revised down its expectations of the permanent scarring effects of the pandemic from an original 3 to 4% to around 2%. Meanwhile, some strange things were happening to the distribution of wealth during those 2 years. Some of the very poorest families saw an increase in their incomes in the early days of recession, as the £20 per week benefit uplift took effect. And some asset prices toppled in the early months of lockdown. But these were very short-term effects. The UC uplift was finally withdrawn in September 2021, with benefits destined for a tiny uplift, way below the prevailing rate of inflation, in April 2022. Meanwhile, and after the initial shock, and in contrast to more normal recessions, asset prices rose. So in the period 2020 to 2022, house prices rose by something in excess of 10%. The solid dark orange line is the UK figure, but you can see something similar was happening across the several countries of the United Kingdom. And global traded assets advanced by something close to 20% after that initial dip or fall taken in the early months of 2020. So a significant rise in levels of wealth through that 2-year period. Many of the longer term social and economic consequences of the pandemic are going to be slow to emerge. We have every reason to think that the long-term impact of educational disruption will be both substantial and unequal, with the privately educated experiencing less disadvantage. And the evidence of previous recessions is that those entering the labour market in hard times experience disadvantages that last across an employment lifetime. The long-term health and social care costs of COVID are imponderable, but likely to be substantial and will again be experienced unequally across the population. So overall, I think we can say the post-COVID welfare state will be significantly bigger. The tax take from the economy projected down to 2024-25 hasn't been so big for 50 years. And it's here to stay. It reveals the neoliberal dream of a lean, mean, low-tax state for what it always was, I think, a myth. At the same time, we have no reason to think that this bigger post-COVID welfare state is going to do anything to address levels of social inequality in its various forms, which we saw prior to 2020. Early evidence suggests that existing inequalities have, if anything, been exacerbated by COVID. We're certainly all in it, but not to the same degree. And here are a couple of graphs taken from the OBR report last autumn, which tell us something, I think, about this big post-COVID welfare state. On the left is the data about spending to GDP ratio, which of course leapt up in 2020 and has fallen steeply again, or is projected to fall steeply, may not come down quite as fast as that in the immediate future, but still leaves it at a level higher than it was pre-pandemic in 2020. I think it's also quite interesting to look at the chart that's on the right-hand side as I look at it, which shows you how that spend was made up, both at the end of the 70s and then in 24-25. And as you'll see, a significantly larger part of that increased spending is in the broadly conceived welfare state. So it's welfare state expenditure which really has increased through that period. And just one other little detail, which it may not be noteworthy. I'm not an economist, so I'm not in a position to say. And the component of debt interest is seen to be much higher in 78, 79, 3.5% than it is projected for 24, 25, where it's at 1.8. And I'm just not sure how sensitive that is to what happens to rates of inflation and subsequently interest rates. There is a very large public debt to be serviced, and I'm not sure how sanguine we can be about how that's going to look. Okay, that's something about the kind of immediate COVID and post-COVID welfare state, but obviously what the welfare state looks like after COVID will be about very much more than just the consequences of pandemic. And in the book, I discuss in some detail 3 of the most important of those future challenges. And here I'm just going to really identify what those are. The first and the best known is the aging of the population. That's a rather ungenerous graphic for the aging of the population, but I took it from a GCSE text. So that's what people of 16 think is going to happen. So I don't have anything very distinctive to say about the aging of the population. It's a long-standing and very familiar, but nothing beyond an unimaginably quick deferral of the age of retirement is going to change it. To its credit, it's not getting a lot of credit these days, to its credit, the Johnson government recognized this in a way no other modern British government has dared to do when it introduced a 3% social levy, half from employees, half from employers, to fund health and social care. But in the first instance, most of this money is to be spent on healthcare. And in the longer term, it just looks inadequate to the scale of the challenge. And its funding through national insurance simply exaggerates one of the key intergenerational unfairnesses of funding future welfare. Second, and for now extremely difficult to quantify, I think, is the prospect of wholesale change in the labour market. We already have a decline in steady long-term employment, which generates a private pension income for its recipients, or which is adequate to enable most people to be able to buy their own home. Beyond this lies the prospect of technological unemployment brought on by automation and AI. This is contested terrain, but upon some accounts, up to 50% of jobs could be destroyed over the next 20 years. The prescient Nobel Prize-winning economist James Mead wrote about this prospect more than 50 years ago. The danger he saw was that under the impulse of automation, we might be headed towards what he called a brave new capitalist paradise, with a few super wealthy owners, a small cohort of highly qualified and well-paid workers running largely automated industrial processes, and a large lump of poorly paid surplus workers providing personal services to the super rich. He called this a hideous outlook. Whatever happens, it looks as though the traditional lifetime work cycle, which underpinned the traditional welfare state, however inadequate and gendered this might have been, is gone forever. The third challenge, in many ways still more profound and already with us, is the climate crisis. Of course, there are some deniers and a few technophiles who think that there is a scientific fix out there, but many informed people believe that in one way or another, we shall have to make do with less. Globally, it's impossible to imagine that the world's growing population could all come to enjoy the levels of affluence and wastage typical of developed states in the north. But this is, of course, where the biggest welfare states are to be found. The traditional welfare state remedy of growing our way out of distributional conflict looks increasingly undoable. Managing with less, perhaps much less, must mean allocating our limited resources differently and more equally, if all are to have at least enough. In the book, I worked through some of the most popular solutions to these problems, ones you might be familiar with: social investment, asset-based welfare, pre-distribution, a universal basic income. But I'm not going to go through those now. I will ask here, as I do in the book, well, what under these circumstances could it possibly look like for us to pursue what I call a strategy of equality? Now, the strategy of equality is a term of some importance in Labour's welfare state history. As a term of art, it dates back to R.H. Tawney's book, Equality, first published in 1931. Here, Tawney argued that the patchwork of social provision that had emerged in Britain by the 1920s in health and education and social welfare should be expanded to deliver for all its citizens an apparatus of social security. It would not yield equality, he thought, but it would mean, and I quote, that differences of remuneration between different individuals would remain, but contrasts between the civilization of different classes would vanish. In the world of Labour after 1945, this morphed into a logic of amelioration, which looked something like this, and this is my paraphrase, that organised labour in parties and unions would mobilise behind an incremental growth in entitlements to both incomes and services based around social citizenship. This would countermand the inequalities generated by an expanding mixed market economy in which governments were the key economic players. It's just a way of trying to summarize what I think that view, that post-war view in Labour came to be. As I grew up in the 1960s and with increasing difficulty in the 1970s, the difficulties were political, not mine. This was, I think, what the mainstream of the Labour Party meant by a strategy of equality. Roughly speaking, it was an idea like this, I think, unarticulated often. And as a sentiment about what the welfare state is supposed to do, I suspect that in some ways it's never quite gone away. If people were pushed to give an account, or people who were of a social democratic disposition were pushed to give an account of what they thought the welfare state was supposed to do. This is the kind of formulation I think they might reach for. However, by the end of the 1970s, it was clear, though not to everyone, that in this form, the strategy had failed. In the only period in which Labour returned to power after 1979, governing as New Labour, this strategy was notionally abandoned in favour of a different approach, an approach which focused on equality of real opportunities, social investment, and social mobility. In the book, I offer a re-evaluation of the New Labour years, which almost immediately became a part of the interminable and unenlightening struggle for the soul of the Labour Party. And in short, I make three judgments. One is that Labour achieved a good deal in this period, especially in relation to pensioner and child poverty, and it invested heavily in public services. But second, the idea that this was somehow the product of a new welfare strategy is, I think, delusional. The new stuff on social mobility, for example, largely failed. The good things that Labour did between 1997 and 2010 were largely the product of an old Labour approach, taxing and spending and redistributing. Thirdly, for all sorts of reasons, some of them the new challenges I discussed previously, and some of them to do with the way in which things have changed since 2010, not least the decline of effective organised labour and the splintering of the Labour vote. For all these, and maybe other reasons too, this strategy was and is now, I think, undoable. It's maybe an irony, but in my account, New Labour was not the first social democratic state of a new kind, but rather the very last throw of the dice for a traditional social democratic state of a kind that is now gone forever. So where does this leave us if we're interested in doing something to reverse the gross inequalities of the past 40 years? If the new social democratic welfare state of New Labour will not get us very far, nor, I think, will turning back to the model that failed in the 1970s, at a time when social and political conditions were much more promising for its success. Strangely, I find some inspiration in going still further back in the Labour story, what happens when you get old, to those foundational thinkers from whom the post-war Labour strategy first emerged. And the most iconic figure here is clearly R.H. Tawney, though there are others. It was, after all, chapter 4 of Tawney's 1931 book, this is the list of page contents down here, that named the strategy of equality. But for Tawney, this could only ever be part of a much wider programme of political change. Contemporary readers of his book, are there any, seldom make the short onward journey from chapter 4 to chapter 5, the conditions of economic freedom. In this chapter, Tawney insists that his own strategy of equality will fail unless, and I quote, there is a radical change has been effected in the balance of economic power. Faced with the contradiction between welfare and investment, which underpinned both the neo-Marxist and the new right critiques of welfare in the 1970s, Tawney was clear that the government should socialise investment. And one other thing I just point you towards in that that listing, the final section of chapter 4, as you see, is the line in the path. Tawney didn't think this was a strategy that would find universal acceptance. There was a line of existing interests which stood in the way and which would somehow have to be gotten out of the road. So Tawney was aware, I think, of that. Some of you will know also Tawney wrote an essay in 1931 when the Labour government, Macdonald's Labour government fell, which has this very famous quotation, which I'm going to misquote, that you can peel an onion layer by layer, but you can't skin a tiger paw by paw. And he says, the business of the tiger is vivisection, and it will get there first. So Tawney was aware not only that there would be resistance to these changes, but that there was a real problem about how you might achieve change incrementally, which in some sense has always been the problem that social democrats have faced. So this, I think, was something like Tawney's position, to summarize it. The post-war revisionists, whose most important exemplar was Tony Crossland, thought that perhaps they could avoid this very unpleasant political logic of shifting the line from the path through the magic of political Keynesianism. But in the long run, and sadly, they were wrong. And we live in very different times, in which organised labour is a shadow of its former self, and in which wealth the ownership of assets, and the intergenerational transmission of wealth, that is inheritance, have become ever more important. The truth is that it's impossible to think of a sustainable future for the well-being of the mass of the population without a real and substantial change in the distribution of wealth. That's perhaps the consequence of spending 20 years looking at the history of private property, but it is what I think. You'll be very disappointed to find I don't have a magic fix, but I will discuss two possible routes out or forward in the most general terms. One is the reallocation of the ownership of capital. It seems probable to me that in its more traditional forms, as worker-owned cooperatives or nationalisation, this is just a political non-starter. But there are alternatives. One example is, again, an idea from James Mead, what he called topsy-turvy nationalisation, in which the state owns not whole sectors or industries, but shares, in this way benefiting from the rise in asset values, which it helps to facilitate. It was an idea which attracted Crossland's support too towards the 1970s, when he was perhaps less persuaded than he was in the 1950s that Keynesianism would do the work he anticipated of it. Still pretty tricky, but perhaps not quite so impossible politically, is a transformation of our tax regime. This can at least be incremental. And in the simplest possible terms, I think, we need to shift the emphasis from taxing incomes, income tax and national insurance, towards taxing wealth. That might include, I think, the more effective taxation of capital gains and of inherited wealth, both of which have become much more consequential over the past 2 decades. And I discussed both of those in some detail in the book. The graph here is lifted from the ONS Wealth and Assets Survey. And there's a lot of detail in there, which you don't need to focus on right now. But what it does indicate, I suppose, with the thick, dark line, is that the amount of resource passing through the estates of people at death has increased substantially, and the amount that people get in that way has increased significantly. I mean, the distributional consequences of inheritance are slightly complicated. You'd expect that inheritance would be enormously important if you're at the top of the profile, because the people at the top of the profile have so much more to hand over, which is true, and that it would be not very consequential for people at the bottom of the pile. In broad terms, that's true, though there is some evidence that there is some inheritance at the bottom end of the wealth profile. Perhaps what's more important politically is what's happened in the middle of that profile. I mean, some of these changes which I'm talking about here have happened, I think, almost under the wire over the last 25 years, that there's been a really substantial change in the distribution of wealth and in the relationship of that privately owned wealth to GDP, for example. And that is not just as straightforward as the idea that the people at the top have run away with it all, because clearly an important component of that is home ownership amongst at least a generation or a generation or two of the middle classes, and the appreciation of that asset and the ability of those people to pass those assets on. As I think we probably all know, inheritance tax is outrageously unpopular in a way which seems quite out of line with its claimed to be a just way of redistributing wealth. And I think it has something to do with those changes. And when we think about the welfare state as it was, even with New Labour, and as it might be in the future, then I think we have to think about the ways in which the distribution of wealth has changed. I think probably in these terms, because I've spent so much time working on property in the last 20 years, but it's also something that's now well established in the kind of public discourse, that we've spent too much time thinking about income and not enough time thinking about wealth. And I think that's probably true. So tax capital gains more effectively, tax inherited or at all, tax inherited wealth more effectively. A personal favorite of mine, which I'm going to take the last example, is the more effective taxation of land values, especially when that's taken in Henry George's extended sense of what he called all natural forces and opportunities. Ever since Henry George, not a professional economist, came up with this idea for a confiscatory land value tax in Progress and Poverty around, I think, 1880, something like that. It's an idea which has been taunted by the taint of crankiness. But it certainly makes sense to me as a fellow non-economist. And land is now an enormous repository of wealth. I mean, obviously land has always been an important source of wealth, as Thomas Piketty kept on pointing out when he talked about Jane Austen, Balzac and people. But it's increasingly important as a repository of wealth. So in 2018, the ONS reported that land, more narrowly defined than by George, made up 51% of the UK's net worth at just over £5 trillion. And you can see the way in which that value has been transformed. The X and the Y axis are not terribly helpful. It looks quite flat, but it isn't flat, is it? That shows the increase in the value of UK land through that period. And they also reported in 2018, household land had doubled in value as a part of that UK wealth value, from 21% to 41% between 1995 and 2017. So it had doubled in what's really a comparatively short, basically 20 years. And of course, that has a profound impact, not just on the amount of wealth, but also on who holds it, as I was suggesting. And one of the stories which I'm not involved in thinking about and telling here is obviously a story about housing and the way in which that has been changed over an extended period. And that element, which is household land, is even bigger now than it was 4 years ago. And I think anyway, it's unanswerably unearned income. It's not the value in the bricks and mortars that has gone up in the last 2 years, for example. It is the value of the land on which the bricks and mortars stand. The downside of this politically, of course, as I've been suggesting, is that this value in land and its unearned increment is now a key middle class perk. Having raised all of these problems about what we might do and how we might do it, and put up some suggestions which I think are on the edge of what people might think about doing, I recognize that this, what I've talked about, is the easy part of the problem. Finding the political agency to effect such a change is, for me anyway, almost unimaginably obscure. So finally, I want to return to the question of welfare after COVID and draw some kind of provisional conclusion. What to do about the welfare state is now, I think, perhaps the political problem of social democratic politics. Whereas for a very long time, social democrats thought it was the solution. If we still want to pursue some sort of strategy of equality, we should just have to find it elsewhere. Or perhaps more accurately, we shall need to change both the welfare state and the wider regime of inequality within which it is embedded, just as Tawney had imagined, none of which is very easy. Thank you.